Today, in Portland's Waterfront Park, stands the Battleship Oregon Memorial Marine Park, along the NATO Parkway between Pine and Oak Streets. But once upon a time, this very park was located several blocks south of here, while still down by the waterfront, just south of the Hawthorne Bridge. The Battleship Oregon itself was stationed at this site, hence the name of the park, which would be dedicated in the spring of 1940. But during its early construction, one of the first completed projects here was a 14-foot-tall statue, standing on a 4-foot-tall base, 18 feet altogether, completed in 1939 and dedicated to the enduring spirit of former President Teddy Roosevelt. It wasn't there long, being removed by the start of 1942, and was a cause for controversy from day one. And also, after it was removed, nobody knows what happened to it. The origins of this memorial to Teddy Roosevelt dates back to the 1920s when veterans of the Spanish-American War, battled during 1898, began collecting funds to erect a monument in the future commemorating the memory of those who fought in this war, as well as Roosevelt, who helped establish and lead America's first volunteer cavalry regiment, best known as the Rough Riders, into battle during this war. Ultimately, Oliver Lawrence Barrett, a professor of sculpture at the University of Oregon, was brought on to produce this memorial. Barrett had already previously done work in Portland on the Szymanski Fountain, located in the city's South Park blocks. His creation would stand at 18 feet tall altogether, if you include its base, and was erected entirely of tufa, a type of sedimentary rock that had been quarried from a site near the town of Bend in Central Oregon. 15 tons of this rock would be used in this creation, placed in the brand new Marine Park to keep an eye on things. It was completed in February 1939. Pictures of the area show this memorial statue in its place while the rest of the park was still mostly just dirt. The figure, staring off in the distance, stands upright with one arm sharply at its side and the other grasping at a sword to the figure's front. And upon a glance, one might note the figure on the statue doesn't look anything like the former president, which makes sense as that was never Barrett's intent in the first place. In his own words, Barrett would say, "It is not designed as a likeness of Roosevelt or anyone else. Rather, it is an attempt to symbolize his indomitable spirit, fighting, but constructive." But with this structure still regarded as a Theodore Roosevelt statue, a likeness of him was chiseled onto its left, or south, side, and below it the quote, "Our nation holds in its hands the fate of the coming years." And while it is regarded as one of Oliver Barrett's most significant works, once this memorial was up, it became significant in an entirely different way. From day one, it was controversial, perhaps because of, well, how nightmarish it was. Numerous words and terms were used to describe it during the short time it was visible to the public. It was a monstrosity, gargantuous, a Frankenstein monster, and for those less creative, they just called it bad art. Perhaps the name that best stuck with it was the Colossus of Portland. Even the Spanish-American war vets didn't exactly love it. The timing was not great either, as World War II was only months away when this memorial was completed, and many felt the likeness of the statue's face best matched with Benito Mussolini, the fascist leader of Italy during that war. Not exactly someone Americans were looking up to at the time. And Roosevelt was beloved in the city, so much so that Portland named a high school after him in the St. John's neighborhood, and there's another statue of him in the South Park blocks, but one specifically done in his likeness. Established in the park blocks in 1922, this statue was beloved as well. The opinions of the average Portlander regarding this statue and the one down on the waterfront were like night and day. It is unfortunate, as this was a remarkable piece of work that one man poured his heart and soul into and produced with the best of intentions. It also would not surprise me that, despite the acknowledgement that this was not an actual statue of Teddy Roosevelt, a lot of people probably just assumed it was and were offended to some level by its appearance. Regardless of Barrett's intent, the statue was a sore spot for a lot of people, and there it was, towering along the waterfront for all to see. Would it surprise anyone that there were strong desires to get rid of this thing? At least, perhaps to a more secluded area? That was the desire, and in 1941, a possible resolution to the matter was suggested. This idea was to move perhaps the city's most prominent piece of sculpture, the Skidmore Fountain, from its place at First and Ankeny to the spot where this memorial was standing. The primary motivation behind this was due to major changes happening where the fountain stood. Front Avenue was expanding, with many of the old, beautiful buildings in the area getting torn down. The atmosphere was changing, but that wasn't enough for the people. The Skidmore Fountain was a city treasure, the complete opposite of the Roosevelt Memorial. Lorado Taft, known as the Dean of American Sculptors, said of the fountain in 1934, "There is no better sculpture in America than this. It is pure classic art." The key here seemed to be as much about getting rid of one thing as it was relocating the other. Come November 1941, the city council rejected this relocation. By this point, however, it didn't matter too much, as the waterfront was entering a stage of transformation itself. Along with the expansion of Front Avenue, the city was preparing to construct a route running parallel to it that would be known as Harbor Drive. This new route would cut right through the middle of the Marine Park, and in particular the site where this memorial was. They could kill two birds with one stone: get a new drive and get rid of the city's Frankenstein monster at the same time. At the time the city council was rejecting the Skidmore Fountain's relocation, the work had begun in breaking down the Roosevelt Memorial. And this was the plan. The base of the memorial would be removed, as is shown in this photograph of the breakdown, allowing the statue to be lowered onto jacks for relocation. But due to the sheer mass and density of the statue, it needed to be separated into pieces to allow for easier transportation. These pieces were taken across the river to the east side and then north to the Stanton Street Storage Yard, located in North Portland near Stanton Street and Kirby Avenue. It would be kept there until a new location was established for it. That's what was reported, and that's what everyone assumed happened.
So you can see somewhat from this perspective that once Harbor Drive kind of hooks off and starts going this way, it does obviously line up with Waterfront Park, which starts over there. But you see as it goes down, it more or less runs even with the NATO Parkway over there, which used to be Front Avenue. And that's not an accident, because even when Harbor Drive went through over here, obviously it was right next to the former Front Avenue. So from where Harbor Drive still exists, let's try our best to kind of go the route that once was, kind of stay in line with it, which I guess starts going through here. What is that? That looks rather ancient. I don't know, maybe it has something to do with the boulevard. But yeah, the road would have more or less just been cutting right through here.
Published in newspapers on November 6, 1941, this is the latest photograph I was ever able to find of this statue, which to a degree makes sense as it was taken during its preparations to be broken down. We can already see the steps leading up to the base of it have been totally removed, and it appears it's already on supports, its next step likely being taken apart into sections to allow for easier transport. At this point, it was only days at the most from relocation. Here was something photographed numerous times, just in the pictures I have found, that stood on site less than 3 years, and yet there are no known photographs of this statue in any state after this. It's like the newspaper articles that discuss the move. There were several articles talking about it in future tense, as it hadn't been moved yet. Articles stating it was going to be moved to Stanton Yard, but no pictures or articles of this move successfully happening. And even though this statue was a sore spot for lots of people, they still probably would have been at least a little interested in this as a side story. But no, nothing in the press about this move officially happening or being completed. I mention this as, with the years gone by, there was no definitive evidence this statue ever made it to its intended destination. The first references I found questioning this matter came in a newspaper article from April 29, 1956, more than a decade after these events. Only by this time were questions starting to be asked. Perhaps because most people were happy to see the behemoth gone and could care less where it ended up. And, somehow, I doubt the city was legitimately invested in finding another outdoor site for the statue, as they said they were. But everyone's also a sucker for a good mystery, and this was fixing to be one. In this 1956 article, they referenced the move to Stanton Yard as something inferred, as opposed to something that actually happened. It would then be more than 15 years further on down the road that things started looking more strange. An Oregonian article from January 9th, 1972, dove a little more into this mystery from a place of actually investigating the matter. In this article, one of the key issues as to how this became a mystery was unveiled. At the time this statue was supposedly taken into storage, circa the end of 1941, start of 1942, it was not required to maintain an inventory of such items. Only later did the Portland City Council make it a requirement to establish an inventory of all of its public monuments. At the time they did this, there is no mention of the Roosevelt statue having been found, and one would assume they at least looked for it. It was still common knowledge that it had been taken to Stanton Yard. This is likely the first moment that city personnel realized they had a missing 14-foot tall, 15-ton statue. So what happened? There are a handful of theories out there. The most boring and probably not true being that things went exactly how it was said they did. These pieces of a statue went to Stanton Yard, and afterward, for whatever reason, they were discarded or misplaced. It could have happened. Perhaps an interested art collector with some deep pockets, interested in the piece's appearance while knowing it was reviled by the whole city, came along and said, "Hey, I'd love to buy that off of you." And the city says, "Sure." They walk away with a little money and now don't have to deal with the responsibility of finding a new spot for said statue. I doubt that happened, but it is by no means impossible. In a later Oregon Live piece, another possibility was suggested, that being that an unknown someone offered to take the statue and stash it specifically in a bunker somewhere. A bunker? Well, we all know where it ended up then. For those new here, Kelly Butte in southeast Portland and the old Civil Defense bunker buried there are things that often revive themselves in my videos a lot. And wouldn't it be so awesome if this massive statue had been stashed there all these years? If only, of course, this bunker hadn't been built more than a decade after this statue was removed. But if this idea, this real idea of the statue being moved to a bunker somewhere had substance to it, then who was this unknown individual? And where was this bunker? I would figure it was at least in the Portland area, considering how massive and heavy this structure was that had to be moved. Questions with no answers, but admittedly also another theory I don't particularly jibe with, while acknowledging it could have happened. So what do I think? I think the city probably just got rid of the thing. I bounce back and forth between whether this was intentional or the result of an accident. But even if it was accidental, the city was still deceptive in that they never admitted this to the people. But I still feel the accident angle is a close second to the intentional angle, even though the accident angle technically has the most, quote, evidence to it, if you can truly call it that. Really, it's just a few secondhand claims. In the 1956 article I mentioned earlier, posted in the Oregon Daily Journal, they state that their paper's art editor had learned personally that the statue fell victim to a bulldozing accident. It doesn't appear this claim was elaborated on any further. And also, in the 1972 article, a city employee named Don Ecton, who worked directly on the inventory that was created for the city's monuments, stated, "I think I remember it cracked when they were taking it apart." He also verified that nobody at Stanton Yard seemed to know whether it had been there, or what happened to it. After looking into the matter himself, Ecton expressed, "It wouldn't surprise me a bit if it isn't underneath that highway. By that highway, he was referencing Harbor Drive, which had been built right over the marine park where the statue once stood. And that is the one area where the intentional and the accidental potentially correlate. Because if the statue was intentionally destroyed, it too may have just been ground down and left in the land that Harbor Drive would be built over. And today, Waterfront Park covers those remains. But if the statue was just destroyed on site, it is impossible that nobody would have witnessed it. This was a massive object that it would have taken a long, loud time to destroy, and it was right out there in the open on the waterfront. Perhaps some people did see it, and their stories were just never told, at least to the public. This was the early 40s, not exactly a bunch of people out running around with their iPhone cameras out. And I can't emphasize enough that I consider the accidental angle a close second to the intentional angle. They're almost neck and neck, as moving something of this size, accidents absolutely can and do occur. It reminds me a bit of the controversial relocation effort of the Ahavath Ahim Synagogue in the 1960s during Portland's South Auditorium Urban Renewal Project, wherein an accident during the relocation efforts led to the building's demolition. But if this statue was damaged beyond saving by accident, it seems to me the city would still just own up to it. This was hardly a beloved item in town. But if one looks at it from the angle of, the city just said they were going to do one thing to cover up the fact that they were just going to trash it, they'd have a reason for this cover story. They easily could have maintained appearances by breaking down the base, putting it on jacks, and making it like an innocent move was about to happen. They could have then moved the pieces somewhere else entirely, where they could have disposed of the unwanted statue unseen. They also could have done this exact same thing if it was an accident as well, just relocating broken pieces. I don't think, though, that they would have gone to such efforts had this just been an accident. But the city didn't want it, the people didn't want it, and the city didn't want the headache of finding a new place for it. There was motivation here to just scrap the thing. This was also prior to the late 60s and 1970s explosion of people in the city trying to preserve things of historic significance, of which this statue may have qualified. This happened at a time where beautiful buildings and structures were being demolished with great frequency, sometimes just to get rid of them. I only mention this to prevent us from looking at this situation too much from a more contemporary perspective, where just trashing something of this substance might draw more resistance. And with this being the 1940s, we were right in the middle of a multi-decade-long period of all sorts of vice and lawlessness, from mayoral corruption to endless speakeasies during Prohibition to rampant organized crime, allowing for things like drugs, prostitution, and gambling to exist with mild resistance. Much of this would hit the spotlight in the 1950s when a full-blown scandal broke in the city, causing a national embarrassment for the City of Roses. So with all of this going on, let me ask you, would getting rid of something nobody wanted and then lying about it register as something that would be a step too far for these kinds of people? Not at all. I honestly believe this statue was either taken somewhere else and dismantled, or, the more risky angle, taken apart in town with some, if not all of its remains left there to be buried under the city's next highway. Had this gigantic piece of work been put into storage, it probably would have still been there when it was searched for. And even without an inventory, if it were relocated, for whatever reason, it still should have been found by now, more than 80 years later. This isn't exactly like looking for a set of lost keys. And if it were to be moved again from Stanton Yard, it would have been another large, coordinated effort. More jacks, several trucks. Another instance that wasn't going to happen without someone noticing, or evidently no one remembering where it was moved to. The fact that there's no, at least corroborating evidence for the few claims that it was accidentally damaged leads me to think it wasn't just accidentally damaged and then ground up and buried under what was then going to be Harbor Drive, as intriguing as that possibility is. But if it's hauled off somewhere and broken up, ditched, or buried, the no witnesses or corroboration makes a little more sense. At least to me. This is just me spitballing. It's what makes the most sense to me. But in the end, no one knows. These are all just theories, but fascinating nonetheless. But man, wouldn't it be so cool if just one day in the near future someone accessed a forgotten storage site or something along those lines, only to discover the massive chunks of a once monumental piece of work, a tall man with his sword, and the etching of Teddy Roosevelt on its side.